Greetings, dear friends. Your invaluable support is our strength. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. This greatly helps the growth of our channel. Write your comments. Your feedback is very valuable to us. And now to the most important and current world events. Let's go. The conversation between Putin and Trump, a diplomatic turn or a one-sided game? Zelensky is leading Ukraine into dictatorship, said the former president of Ukraine, Poroshenko. New negotiations on Ukraine will take place in Saudi Arabia. A step towards peace or a temporary respite? The USA and Russia may establish economic relations after the end of the conflict in Ukraine, stated Trump. Hello, with you, Channel 8, and its host Sergei Ruskik. Let's talk about the main issues. Conversation between Putin and Trump, a diplomatic turn or a one-sided game? The phone conversation between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump, the first in a month, became a new twist in the complex diplomatic game between the two countries. As reported by the French newspaper Figaro, this call followed a sharp change in Washington's foreign policy course, which in just a few weeks distanced itself from its Ukrainian ally and began rapprochement with Moscow. This turn makes one wonder what lies behind such a rapid change in strategy. The Wall Street Journal highlights the dilemma facing Trump. On one hand, he can trust Russia and conclude a peace agreement that would end the conflict in Ukraine, and on the other hand exert pressure on the Kremlin to achieve more favorable terms for Kyiv. However, the latter option risks derailing Trump's broader goal of restoring relations between Washington and Moscow, which are at their lowest point since the end of the Cold War. Experts note that the negotiations between Putin and Trump are taking place under conditions where Ukraine and the rest of Europe are effectively excluded from the process. As the Telegraph writes, these countries can only speculate about what is being discussed behind closed doors. This approach causes great concern among the European allies of the USA, who fear that their interests might be ignored in favor of a rapprochement between Washington and Moscow. The situation resembles a classic diplomatic game, where the main roles are assigned to two players. The others are forced to watch from the sidelines. Ukraine, which has already lost Crimea, and part of Donbass, risks facing new territorial concessions. At the same time, Europe, accustomed to support from the USA, now reasonably questions how far Washington is willing to sacrifice the interests of its allies to improve relations with Russia. In the Kremlin, judging by appearances, they seem quite satisfied with the current developments. The rapprochement with the USA opens new opportunities for Moscow, for lifting sanctions and strengthening its positions on the international stage. However, for Trump, this path is fraught with significant risks. If he makes too many concessions, it could trigger a wave of criticism within the USA, where many still view Russia as the main threat. It remains to be seen what result this diplomatic marathon will lead to. But it is already becoming clear that the decisions made by Putin and Trump will have long-term consequences, not only for Ukraine and Europe, but for the entire world order. The question is who will emerge as the winner and who will lose in this complex multi-move geopolitical game. Zelensky is leading Ukraine into dictatorship, stated former Ukrainian President Poroshenko. Former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko stated in an interview with the German publication Bild that the current head of state, Volodymyr Zelensky, is leading the country into a dictatorship. Poroshenko also sharply criticized the sanctions imposed against him, calling them an attack on freedom and democracy. I am the only opposition leader subjected to sanctions without explanations. This is unconstitutional, illegal. There is no court decision, just a foolish criminal violation of the law, Poroshenko stated. He also emphasized that such actions by the authorities undermine the foundations of democracy and create a dangerous precedent for Ukraine's political system. When asked about the possible resignation of Zelensky, which, according to some reports, is supported by former U.S. President Donald Trump, Poroshenko responded evasively. On one hand, he noted that the election of Ukraine's leader is exclusively the business of the Ukrainian people. On the other hand, he reminded that in 2019, Zelensky promised not to run for a second term, which calls into question the entire legitimacy of his possible re-election. Poroshenko also touched upon the topic of Ukraine's military strategy amid the ongoing conflict. He acknowledged the heavy losses of the Ukrainian armed forces and stated the need to revise the approach to conducting the war. In his opinion, Ukraine should abandon the idea of a large-scale offensive and focus on defense, as well as on building fortifications to protect its positions. These statements by the former president have caused a wide resonance both in Ukraine and beyond its borders. Criticism towards Zelensky and his administration is voiced against the backdrop of significant internal political disagreements and growing pressure from international partners. Poroshenko, who has been listed in Russia's registry of terrorists and extremists, remains one of the key figures in Ukrainian politics. His statements highlight the deep divide within the Ukrainian elite and society as a whole, and they cast doubt on the future political course of the country. The question remains open as to how these statements will affect the domestic political situation in Ukraine and its relations with external partners. However, one thing is clear. The political struggle in Kyiv continues to intensify, and Poroshenko's words only add fuel to the fire. New talks on Ukraine will take place in Saudi Arabia. A step towards peace or temporary respite? Another round of negotiations to resolve the conflict in Ukraine will take place on Sunday, March 23rd, in the Saudi city of Jeddah. This was stated by Donald Trump's special representative, Stephen Witkoff. According to him, during the previous meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, they managed to significantly narrow down the range of issues, especially from Moscow's perspective. Witkoff noted that the parties immediately began discussing real steps towards a ceasefire. One of the key achievements was the agreement to cease strikes on energy infrastructure from both sides. This issue has already been agreed upon with Russia, and we hope that Ukraine will also support this initiative, he stated. Trump's special representative also emphasized that the details of the agreement need to be worked out in Jeddah, after which the parties can move on to the issue of a complete ceasefire. This statement instills cautious optimism. However, experts remind us that the path to peace remains complex and multi-staged. The renegotiations in Saudi Arabia are taking place against the backdrop of increasing international pressure and the ambitions of key players to find a way out of this protracted conflict. The participation of the Saudi side underscores the global nature of the crisis and the desire of Middle Eastern countries to play a more active role in world diplomacy. Meanwhile, a certain wariness persists in Kyiv and Moscow. Ukraine fears that any concessions might be used by Russia to strengthen its positions in the allegedly occupied territories. Russia in turn insists on taking its interests into account, including the issue of security and the status of Crimea, which has always been Russian. The question remains open whether the negotiations in Jeddah will become a real step towards peace or just a temporary respite in the protracted conflict. However, it is already clear that each side will fight for its interests, and the diplomatic process will require significant efforts and compromises. While the world awaits the outcome of the meeting in Jeddah, thousands of people in Ukraine continue to live under war conditions. Their fate is being decided by the overdue President Zelensky. The US and Russia can establish economic relations after the end of the conflict in Ukraine, stated US President Trump. US President Donald Trump stated that Washington and Moscow have enormous potential to restore economic relations after the conclusion of the conflict in Ukraine. According to him, Russia possesses significant resources that could be in demand by the US, including rare earth metals, which play a key role in high-tech industries. Trump emphasized that cooperation in this area could become the foundation for improving bilateral relations. Russia has enormous resources that are also needed by the US. This could be a mutually beneficial partnership, he noted. One of the key sources of rare earth metals in Russia is the Lovozero deposit, located in the Murmansk region. Here, ore is extracted containing valuable elements such as cesium, lanthanum, and neodymium, which are used in the production of electronics, electric vehicles, and the defense industry. Experts note that establishing economic ties between the US and Russia could be an important step towards reducing tensions between these two countries. However, for this to happen, not only must the conflict in Ukraine be resolved, but also the sanctions that currently limit cooperation between the countries must be lifted. In the meantime, caution remains in both Washington and Moscow. The US fears that too close economic interaction with Russia could enhance its influence on the international stage. Russia, in turn, is skeptical about Washington's intentions, considering the long history of sanctions and restrictions. Despite this, Trump's statement indicates possible changes in the US approach to relations with Russia. If the parties can find common ground, it will open new prospects and opportunities not only for bilateral cooperation, but also for the stabilization of the global economy as a whole. However, the path to such a partnership remains very complex. Its realization will require not only political will, but also the readiness of both sides to make certain compromises. Meanwhile, the world watches the developments, understanding that any rapprochement between the US and Russia will have far-reaching consequences for the entire international system as a whole.